The Silk Road wasn't silk. It wasn't a road. And for roughly 1,500 years, the merchants who actually used it didn't call it anything at all. Think about what you already know about the Silk Road. A single route, caravans of silk, merchants traveling from China to Rome, end to end, carrying the most precious fabric in the ancient world. That image is almost entirely wrong. And the story of how it became so wrong is almost as interesting as the real history. This is no history. We reconstruct history from the objects that survive, the routes that don't, and the names that outlive their meanings. Let's start with what the Silk Roads actually were. Not one road, not even 10 roads. A network of overlapping, competing, sometimes contradictory paths through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. The Taklamakan Desert, the Hindu Kush, the Iranian Plateau, the steppes of Central Asia. No single route crossed all of them. No single merchant needed to. The story begins in the 2nd century BCE with a Han Dynasty diplomat named Zhang Qian. The Han Emperor Wu had a problem. To the north and west, nomadic confederacies, the Xiongnu, controlled the steppe and raided Chinese settlements relentlessly. Emperor Wu sent Zhang Qian west to find potential military allies, specifically a people called the Yuezhi, who had been pushed further west by the Xiongnu and might share China's interest in fighting them. Zhang Qian spent over a decade traveling. He was captured by the Xiongnu. He escaped. He kept going. He never secured the military alliance, but he came back with something more valuable: knowledge. He described Fergana horses, tall, powerful animals the Chinese called heavenly horses, bred in what is now Uzbekistan. The Han Emperor wanted them badly enough to go to war over access to the breeding grounds. Zhang Qian also described trade goods already moving through Bactria that had originated in China. Silk, traveling westward without any formal Chinese involvement. The routes were already forming. Zhang Qian didn't create them. He mapped what merchants had already begun. Here's a question that doesn't get asked enough. If no single merchant traveled the entire 4,000 miles, who actually moved the goods? The answer, for roughly 3 centuries between approximately 500 and 800 CE, was the Sogdians. Sogdian merchants came from the river valleys of what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, a region called Sogdia, centered on cities like Samarkand and Bukhara. They were not a great empire. They had no standing army, no imperial bureaucracy, no territorial ambitions beyond the next market town. What they had was something more durable: language, kinship networks, and an extraordinary talent for operating across political boundaries. These letters, found near Dunhuang, written around 313 CE, are among the oldest direct documentary evidence of merchant networks on the Silk Roads. They weren't written for posterity. They were business correspondence, reports on market conditions, complaints about delayed payments, requests for specific goods. One letter describes a merchant stranded in China after political upheaval cut off his route home. He isn't panicking, he's calculating. He's asking his partners to reroute shipments through an alternative corridor. That letter sat unread in a sealed cave near Dunhuang for 1,600 years. These were professionals running a relay system that spanned a continent, and most of them never left their regional segment. A Sogdian merchant in Samarkand might buy silk from a Chinese trader arriving from the east, hold it in a warehouse, and sell it to a Persian trader heading west, without ever setting foot in China or Persia. The fragmentation wasn't a flaw, it was the business model. Now let's talk about silk. Silk did move along these routes, significant quantities of it. The Chinese state actively managed silk production and used it as a diplomatic currency, gifts to foreign rulers, payments to nomadic confederacies to keep the peace. But here's what the name erases: horses. The Han Dynasty wanted Fergana horses so badly that Emperor Wu launched at least 2 major military campaigns just to secure access to the breeding grounds. These weren't luxury goods. They were weapons platforms, taller, faster, and more powerful than anything the Chinese cavalry had bred domestically. The military calculus of the entire eastern steppe shifted when those horses moved east. Lapis lazuli, that deep blue stone from the Badakhshan mines in northeastern Afghanistan, moved westward for thousands of years before silk routes even existed. Lapis reached ancient Egypt. It reached Mesopotamia. It was in Tutankhamun's burial mask. It was ground into the ultramarine pigment that medieval European painters used for the Virgin Mary's robes. The same mines, the same stone. Moving through relay networks that predate the Han Dynasty by millennia. The Silk Roads didn't invent the relay system. They inherited it from a lapis trade that was already ancient when Zhang Qian was born. Paper moved east to west, one of the most consequential technology transfers in human history. Paper reached the Islamic world by the 8th century CE and Europe by the 12th. It was lighter than papyrus, cheaper than parchment, and it carried ideas at a speed no previous writing surface could match. The printing press is often credited with the information revolution of the 15th century, but paper had to arrive first, and it arrived along these routes. And something else moved along these routes that no customs official could tax and no merchant could physically carry. Ideas. Buddhism spread from India into Central Asia and then into China along these same corridors. The Mogao Caves at Dunhuang, thousands of murals, tens of thousands of manuscripts, were funded in part by merchants who adopted the faith and saw the caves as both pilgrimage sites and rest stops along the trade routes. Imperial patronage and Buddhist missionary activity drove their construction, but the merchants who moved through this corridor contributed to their growth and helped sustain the communities that maintained them. Nestorian Christianity reached Tang Dynasty China by 635 CE. A Syrian monk arrived in Chang'an. A church was established. We know this because a stone stele, erected in 781 CE, records the event in both Chinese and Syriac. 2 languages, 1 stone, proof that the relay corridors carried more than cargo. The Silk Roads moved silk. They also moved horses, stone, paper, spices, glassware, coins, and the architecture of belief itself. The name remembers one thread. The history contains hundreds. In 1877, a German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen published the first volume of a monumental work on China. Von Richthofen had traveled extensively in China in the 1860s. He was a serious scholar, a rigorous observer, and deeply interested in the geography of ancient trade. In his book, he coined the term Seidenstraßen, Silk Roads, to describe the ancient overland routes connecting China to Central Asia and the West. The routes he was naming had been largely inactive for centuries. Maritime trade routes around Africa had redirected global commerce by the 15th century. The Mongol Empire, which had briefly unified much of the overland network in the 13th century, had long since fragmented. Von Richthofen was naming a ghost, and the name stuck, powerfully, romantically, misleadingly. Because Silk Road sounds like something you could walk, something with a beginning and an end, something a single heroic traveler could complete. The actual network had no name when it functioned. it got a name when it was already gone. And the name it got told the story of the commodity that fascinated European buyers, not the commodity that actually drove the network's deepest logic. Here's what took me a long time to understand about these routes. We tend to think of trade networks as systems that work best when they're transparent, when information flows freely, when buyers and sellers can find each other directly. The Silk Roads were the opposite of that. And that wasn't a failure. A Sogdian merchant in Samarkand didn't want the Chinese silk producer to know what price Byzantine buyers would pay. The fragmentation was the profit. Every intermediary in the chain controlled one thing: information asymmetry. They knew the price on one side of the transaction. Their counterpart knew the price on the other side. Neither knew both.
This is why no merchant needed to travel the full 4,000 miles. Traveling the full distance would have meant revealing the full price differential. It would have destroyed the business model. The opacity wasn't a bug. It was the architecture. The Chinese emperor didn't know what Roman senators paid for silk. The Roman senator didn't know where silk came from. The Sogdian merchant in Samarkand knew both, and told neither. That asymmetry, that deliberate opacity, is what made the network function for 15 centuries. It wasn't a highway connecting civilizations. It was a sequence of local markets, each controlled by specialists who understood their segment and profited from keeping it opaque. And when Ferdinand von Richthofen drew a single romantic line across his map in 1877, he erased all of that. He gave us a road. The history gave us a system. The Silk Roads remind us that commerce doesn't need transparency to function. It needs trust at each local node and opacity between nodes. That structure didn't end with the Sogdian merchants. It just moved into commodity brokers, shipping intermediaries, and every supply chain where the manufacturer doesn't know the retail price and the retailer doesn't know the manufacturing cost. The name Silk Road, Ferdinand von Richthofen's invention, applied to a network that had been silent for 4 centuries before he picked up his pen, gave us a story about connection. A single thread linking east and west. The actual history gives us something more useful. A story about how intermediaries shape the world, how naming shapes history, and how the most powerful networks are often the ones nobody can see in full. The Silk Roads were built by people who never saw the end of the line. That's the real story. But if the routes were unmapped and the merchants were strangers to each other, how did anyone trust that lapis lazuli from Badakhshan would actually reach a Roman senator's hands? That question, about how trust works across distance, across language, across centuries, points somewhere we haven't gone yet. I'm here to help you know history from the objects that survive, the roots that don't, and the names that outlive their meanings. Zhang Qian went west looking for military alliances, not silk. What he found instead was knowledge of horses and trade goods already moving through the network. The Sogdian merchants built their fortunes on lapis lazuli, paper, and Fergana stallions, not on the commodity that got the road named after it. So which of those three, the horse that rewrote steppe warfare, the paper that carried every idea westward, or the blue stone from Badakhshan that was already ancient when Zhang Qian was born, actually shaped the medieval world more than silk ever did? See you on the next trade route.